Good afternoon. My name is Parveen Rustam Farhan, and I'm the Government Publications Librarian here at the libraries. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on voting and the importance of the youth vote. An active, aware, and participated electorate is the cornerstone of a vibrant and working democracy. Our midterm elections are going to be held on November 8th. From now until then, let's familiarize ourselves with the current landscape of candidates and events and issues so we may become better informed to choose our political leaders at the local, state, and national levels. It seems appropriate to hold this event in conjunction with National Voter Registration Day and the library's voter registration drive to shine a light on the importance of participating in the political process. The deadline to register to vote in Tennessee is October 11th. If you haven't registered already, please do so at our voter registration table outside the library, outside the foyer on your way out. I'd like to call your attention to two government documents displays in the elevator area on the first floor. One is on Constitution Day and Citizenship Day, which was September 17th, and the other on our midterm elections. Check out also the library's blog on National Voter Registration Day, where you will find helpful links for voting resources. Without further delay, I'd like to turn this over to Carl Hess, the first-year experienced librarian, who is going to moderate our session today.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you. As said, I'm Carl Hess, and I'm going to be kind of doing moderating today, which means I will be introducing each one of our panelists. They will come up, give a short presentation, and then we will get up here and take questions from the audience. So, without further ado, we'll pull up our first presenter. Oh, and there it goes. So, Dr. Cookie Woolner is Associate Professor of History with a focus on the history of race, gender, and sexuality in modern U.S. culture. She is also interested in the histories of subcultures, social justice movements, and activism. She will be moderating on an upcoming panel on October 21st in the UC about the end of Roe and reproductive history. Dr. Woolner?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much for coming out. Thank you so much to everyone in the library for inviting me. I'm very happy to come speak to you today. I spend a lot of time in my modern U.S. history class. It's History 2020. I'm talking about how young people have fought for social change. And I see being a voter as a central part of being an active citizen in a democracy. But ideally, it also shouldn't be the only thing we do to make our communities and country a better place. And as a historian, I know there's a very inspiring history of young people's activism, so I'm briefly going to discuss one moment of that, which was connected to voting rights in the South during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. Then I'll briefly discuss the fight to lower the voting age from 21 to 18, which was also an effort carried out by young people. But first, I'm just going to very briefly do a really quick overview on the history of voting rights to remind people here that for much of this nation's history, many Americans did not even have the right to vote. And so actually even before this first moment on the left here, it's important to note that in early America, not just white men, but only the white men who owned property, right, were seen as the people who were allowed to have the right to vote. They were the ones seen as the most independent and rational, and really the only ones able to make this choice here. Basically, early on, the framers of the U.S. Constitution saw young Americans as expected to be deferential to their elders, right? So people of color, women, young people are all seen as kind of dependent on others, so they weren't seen as really deserving the right to have the vote, right? So for many years in this nation, so many people have not had this right. So now that we have it, this is something we need to exercise. So right here's just a few brief landmarks here. So in 1870, we have the 15th Amendment giving African American men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, thanks to all the work of women's suffrage, passes in 1920, but of course it's important to note that not all women got the right to vote in 1920, right? African American women in the South did not get that vote right until 1964, we see here. Of course, with the Voting Rights Act as well. And then I will talk a little bit more about this last point here, the 26th Amendment from 1971, which will finally extend the vote to 18-year-olds, right? So it's important to know that all of these moments are really kind of brought on to not only to government change, but to grassroots activism by people demanding to have this right of citizenship, right? So again, it's important to keep in mind this long struggle for the vote, and just to remind us the importance of using our vote, right? Because people fought and have died fighting for this right to exercise their citizenship. All right, so moving now a little forward into from early America to 1964, we have one of the more well-known moments of the civil rights movement. We have here an image of young college students who are become known as Freedom Riders, taking part in Freedom Summer, which was a summer project through some of the civil rights activist groups such as SNCC, the Student Nonviolence Committee, which had the idea to send both Black and white college students to southern states such as Mississippi to focus on getting rural Southern African Americans registered to vote, right? Because even though they were supposedly had this right at the state level, there were all these poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests, all these barriers created to keep them from voting, right? So their job of these students is to go down to the South, knock at people's doors, and educate them about the voting process and how to actually cast their ballots. And this, of course, will become a moment that is seen as threatening to many who still want to have this white supremacist system in place in the South, right? So we'll have at least 3 young voting activists murdered in this moment. They're seen as a threat, right, for kind of symbolizing, uniting Black and white youth coming together, trying to get everybody the right to vote. So again, this is kind of a moment of inspiration we can draw. The civil rights movement was very much led by many young people. We can also think of the sit-in movement starting in 1960, started by African American college students in North Carolina. So kind of throughout the 50s and 60s, we're seeing more and more young people getting involved in this movement for racial justice, right? So this is kind of bringing young people and college students more to the fore of mainstream America than ever before. And the work they do really makes a big difference. At the beginning of SNCC's time going down to Mississippi, only 5% of the state's eligible Black voters were registered. And I believe it rose up to 60% were registered after the Civil Rights Act of 1965. So we're seeing a large difference here. And also many newly enfranchised Black voters in the South who are mostly under the age of 30 are making their voices heard. So we're seeing many people who have this new right vote exercising it and using it, right? Not just taking it for granted. Right, so then as I mentioned, we have this movement to lower the voting age from 21 to 18. And this becomes successful in 1971, but this is something that many people had been hoping to fight for earlier, ever since this age limit was created in 1942. There'd always been this tension, of course, between the fact that young men could be conscripted into the military service at age 18, but they didn't actually have the right to vote yet, right? So that becomes kind of the pivotal point here. It's no coincidence that this shift goes on during the Vietnam War, right? We're seeing the largest anti-war movement the country has ever seen, of course spearheaded by young people here, and they're kind of trying to raise visibility to this hypocrisy, right? This idea that, here I have a quote from one senator who says, if young men are to be drafted at 18 years of age to fight for their government, they ought to be entitled to vote at 18 years of age for the kind of government for which they are best satisfied to fight. And so again, we see a lot of young people not only from civil rights organizations, but youth-centered groups who are forming coalitions to coordinate lobbying and grassroots efforts aimed to lower the voting age. And so again, here's an image from 1969, and this becomes a successful amendment, the 26th Amendment, by 1971. And 5 decades later, since the passing of the 26th Amendment, the U.S. has experienced unprecedented levels of youth voter turnout. Right, so this shift throughout the literally 18, more and more young people have gotten involved. Youth turnout in the 2020 election reached one of the highest youth participation rates in decades. So also start my historical
Nonsense
here.
somewhere else that might.
And I go bring about how young people in the past have fought for the right to vote and exercise their own right to vote. We'll inspire you to register to vote. Again, you can register downstairs until 2 p.m. Also, you can also get involved in the political process, not only through electoral politics, but activism and other ways which we'll be discussing. So thank you for your time, and now I'll pass it on to my colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Woolman. It says it's on. It's on. All right. Up next, we have Professor Otis Sanford. Professor Sanford. Yay. Professor Sanford holds the Hardin Chair of Excellence in Journalism and Strategic Media at the U of M. He is also the political analyst and commentator for ABC 24 News and WKNO FM, and writes a political column for the Daily Memphian. Sanford is the former managing editor of the Commercial Appeal and is author of the 2017 book, From Boss Crump to King Willie, How Race Changed Memphis Politics.
I brought my own cheering section today. And I'm getting extra credit for that. The tablet's right over there on the corner if you haven't signed up. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here today. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to start by sort of following up on Dr. Wilson's presentation, because I factor into what you just said. I first voted in 1972, 1 year after the extension came to 18 years old. And I was 19 at the time. That was the very first time I voted. And it was an exhilarating experience to be able to vote at age 19. My mother, though, first voted when she was 54, because she was one of the first African Americans in our county down in Mississippi to register to vote after the Voting Rights Act. And that's just the interesting dynamic there of she had to wait till she was 54 when I voted at age 19. And I've cherished that vote ever since. But what I want to briefly talk about is just sort of the idea or the notion that it's not just enough to register to vote, which is what a lot of you are doing today. You have to follow through and actually vote. And I'm glad you mentioned the date of the next election, the midterm elections in November. Please make a plan to register to vote. I don't want to inundate you with numbers here, but my presentation does have to do with numbers. But I'm not going to overpower you. I just want to give you some examples of the registration versus the actual turnout through the years. And I'll start here with 1984. You'll see that, and this is just in Shelby County. The registration number of registered voters in Shelby County in 1984 was 482,000. The turnout was 340,600. That represented a 70% turnout, which was incredibly, it was great. 70% is pretty good. In 1992, in the election, this is all presidential elections, in which Bill Clinton was elected over an incumbent Bush. The turnout was even higher at 73%. We had 498,000 registrants, 365,000 people in Shelby County actually voted. And this was before we had early voting. Early voting didn't start in Shelby County until the early 1990s. So everybody either absentee or they showed up on election day, and it was a 73% turnout in 1992. It has actually, and unfortunately, been going downhill ever since, to some great degree. with the slight exception of what you mentioned, Cookie, which was 2020, and I'll talk about that in a second. But see how it is going down here. Even in 2008, which was a historical presidential election, you see how the registrations went through the roof. People registered to vote in 2008. They were excited. Young people got excited because Barack Obama was on the ballot, first African-American, potentially African-American president. People registered to vote here in this county, and our registrations reached 653,000 in the county. That was huge. Not all of them obviously turned out. It was a high number at 398,000, but that's still only represented 60 or just right at 61% of the vote. If the number had been the same for, say, 1992, there were only like 133,000 fewer actual voters than registered voters. If that had been the case in 2008, the voter turnout would have been 81%, and which would have been off the charts. So again, it's not enough to just register. You have to turn out. And going to 2020, that was a high turnout year, primarily because there were a lot of people who wanted to express their vote that year because they didn't do it in 2016. And we see what happened. So people wanted to vote in 2020. A lot of them were motivated by the Donald Trump factor. And so the turnout did go up in 2020 to almost 66%. But still, it has not reached that 70% threshold. Again, not because of the actual number of voters, it's the number of voters as opposed to registered voters. It's great. I'm gonna keep beating this drum. It's great to register, but it's even better to actually follow through and actually vote. By early voting, by absentee voting, on election day, you've got so many opportunities to do that. And then I'm just going to go very briefly here to, this is representing the Memphis city elections since 1982. And we see the turnout numbers are even worse, really. The high water mark was in 1991. In 1991 in Memphis, it was a historic election again. Dr. Willie W. Harrington was running to become the first elected African-American mayor in the city. And he was running against an incumbent, Dick Hackett. There was huge interest in this election. And so the turnout, the registrations actually went up well, it actually didn't go up as much as it was in '83, but the turnout was higher. We had a 65% turnout in 1991 for a city election. That was really huge as well. It has not reached come anywhere close since then. As a matter of fact, look at the numbers in recent elections. In 2011, we just had 18% turnout for a city election. In 2015, the first year that Jim Strickland was elected, just 28% turnout. And then 3 years ago, in 2019, when Strickland won re-election, just 26% of registered voters turned out. We turn out in respectable numbers for presidential elections, in respectable numbers. Still, I think needs to be higher. But we don't turn out for midterm elections like we have this year. We certainly don't turn out for county elections like we should, and we don't turn out for the city elections like we should. Voting, who you elect at the local level has a lot more impact on your lives than who you elect at the national level in a lot of cases. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. And so when we talk about voting, I'm going to say this for the third or fourth time. I love the fact that we are registering to vote. We had 414,000 registrants in 2011, but the turnout was 74,000. I mean, we had 300,000 people who didn't show up. And we only had 18%. So registering to vote is fine, but you gotta follow through and turn out. And I'll end with a shameless plug here, because as you mentioned, I do a commentary every afternoon on Channel 24, and my commentary this afternoon is on this very subject. And I make the point that if young people, 18 to 25, if they would reach a voter turnout level that would even get close to 50%, I guarantee you the politicians would think differently about what you want, what you need, how you feel, and they would not sort of take you for granted or take for granted that you're not going to show up at the polls. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, I think, in the Q&A, because I think there are some questions that get to that point, and I think you might get to that point as well. But if you register and then turn out, the politicians will pay attention to you a lot. So thank you so much, and now I'll turn it back.
Thank you, Dr. Sam. And now, for our last presentation, Ebony Dawkins-Meeks is Assistant Professor of Teaching in the Department of Political Science. Her teaching focuses on issues of law and justice in the United States. Prior to teaching at the University of Memphis, she worked as an attorney in state and federal courts in Tennessee. Part of her service in her legal work both in restoration of voting rights and election protection. Finally, she has spoken to various communities about the importance of voting as a political strategy.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the McWhorter Library and the University of Memphis for putting this very important event on. I want to try to move us through from theory, why we are doing the things we're doing, to reality, how we can manifest the theory. So we're going to do that by briefly zooming through a bit of history about the political theory that supports youth voting, to strategies that I believe young people can employ in order to ensure that their vote is heard and registered. So a lot of the work that I do in the Department of Political Science is around political theory, and the major questions in political theory are, what is the purpose of government? What do we want our government to be doing for us? What are the appropriate rights of citizens? And finally, what does it take to make a good society? And I submit to you in this moment that young people know what it takes to make a good society because you're living in it and the society is for you. There is a deep consideration and exploration in political theory that the best kind of society to live in is one in which the people are treated as citizens who retain their power and who are able to exercise their power against the governments that are instituted for them. We see this, for example, in 1513, when Niccolo Machiavelli writes The Prince, and he begins exploring this idea of it is better to have a republic versus a monarchy. This idea is elevated by new political theorists who discuss his ideas. The next idea I want to talk about from political theory is social contract theory. Now, this is a theory that says that there's an agreement between government and citizens, that the government is going to protect them in certain kinds of ways if the citizens give up certain things that, they would much rather do. But it's like a contract between you and the place where you are. Now, there are lots of theorists who explore this idea, but the key takeaway here, and the one that I think that is most illuminating for young voters, is that in order for the authority of the government to be legitimate, it must be done with the consent of the people. And that's where voting comes in. So let's talk a little bit about youth voting. First, We can see these elements of social contract theory in the United States Constitution, which, as Dr. Woolmer pointed out earlier in her talk, the United States Constitution provides us with the basis for youth voting through its amendments. Now, this is a document that's organized for the creation of the government. It sets out the duties of the government, and it also sets out the preservation of rights for citizens. We see this in the 10th Amendment, which tells us that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved not only to the states, but also to its people. This is where we find what I call people power within the United States Constitution, meaning that the Constitution has already contemplated that you should have power and you do have power. Now, when it comes to the youth vote, we see this in the 26th Amendment, which provides us with the preservation of the right to vote for people who are 18 years of age and older. Now, as Dr. Woolmer pointed out, this amendment was added to the Constitution in July of 1971 after a decades-long agitation by young people who were saying to the United States government, listen, if we can put on a military uniform and go fight abroad, if we can go out and get higher education degrees in colleges, if we can work in industries that support the progress of the United States, then surely we should be able to register our concerns and desires for the nation through our vote. Next, I want to talk about what that has actually looked like over the years. So, as Professor Sanford noted, the actual turnout for voters across the board has kind of been up and down, and that depends on a whole lot of factors. Who's running, how people feel, what are the big issues. But particularly when it comes to youth voting, what we see is sharp declines and sharp increases, with one of the highest increases being in the 2020 election, where we see 55% of the eligible youth voters actually turning out to vote. And I think that is because young people, just like everybody else, can see, sense, and feel that there's something very important happening in the nation, right? The issue, though, that most people have is with the inconsistency of youth turnout and voting. One of the major issues, and if you've ever taken a class from me, you know that I'm a person that wants to think about systems, and I want to think about institutions. One of the major issues that we see that leads to inconsistent youth turnout is that when the 26th Amendment actually gets ratified, there are no accompanying changes that make it possible for young people to really know how to use this privilege of voting. The other problem, of course, is that across the United States, many states, including the state of Tennessee, have instituted barriers to voting. One example that I think is really important for the time in which we're living is the rescinding of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which removed certain barriers that made it so that the states needed to get what was called pre-clearance in order to make changes to their voting systems or voting rules. Now, the purpose of that pre-clearance was to ensure that nobody would be disenfranchised from their vote. But 9 years ago, when this section of the Voting Rights Act was repealed, what we see is states almost immediately beginning to institute rules that place barriers on voting. In the state of Tennessee, one of the major barriers that we see has to do with student voters, young people like the people in this room. In Tennessee, a teacher at the University of Memphis can use their University of Memphis ID to vote. A student at the University of Memphis cannot use their University of Memphis ID to vote. This is highly problematic because what this means is that an out-of-state student or even a student who may not have a driver's license or other state ID would either be infringed from voting or need to go extra steps in order to get the appropriate kind of ID to vote. Now, I want you to know that students in the state of Tennessee have fought against this. There has been a lawsuit about this. Unfortunately, students in the state of Tennessee lost this lawsuit. So right now, if you go to the Secretary of State website, you will see that if you are a student, you cannot use your state school student ID to vote. Despite all of this, we know that young people are still trying to vote and still turning out to vote. In the year 2020, it's estimated that between 52 to 55% of eligible student voters or young voters voted. And it is issues like management of the pandemic, violence and policing, the state of the economy, changes in the environment, whether or not people will have access to affordable health care, people desiring more progressive immigration policies and even desiring gun control restrictions that are pushing and propelling young people to vote. What I believe is that young people are aware of what's happening in their world. And I want you to know that even if you're 18 or 19 or 20 or 25 or 75, because you are here, what you believe and feel about what's happening in your world matters, and you should, under social contract theory, under these ideas about the creation of a good society, be able to register your concern. And voting is one of the first places that we can do that. So how do we get to a place where more people are actually able to access this right to vote? I present a 3-step plan. Education. For individuals, you can visit your election commission's online information center. Thank goodness we live in the information age, right? Everything is at the tip of your fingers. You can get this information about how do I vote in my county? Where do I go to register to vote? You can also use the internet in order to research candidates and issues before you actually go to vote. The next is making a plan. Professor Sanford talked about making a plan. What does that mean? When I make a plan for voting day, I need to know, where am I going? Am I going to go for an early voting day, or am I going to go on election day? How much time should I really take out of my day in order to vote? I suggest at least 2 or 3 hours. You know, you might want to get lunch, right? Determine the optimal time for you to go. Bring the correct ID with you. Know what the rules are in your state or county around voting. And finally, the third part, and this is where each one of us can do our best in order to increase voter turnout, is organizing. Not only should you double check your voter registration status, check that of your family members and your friends. Encourage people that you know to register to vote. And then make sure people get to the polls. You can have a caravan. You all can, follow one another. You can catch an Uber X, right, if you have the money for it. These are all things that we can do in order to ensure that all of us have an opportunity to have our voices heard. In summary, what I want to say to each and every person in this room is that your vote is necessary. And it is important to your future, it's important to my future, it's important to our future. And government happens with your consent. Voting is the first, although not the only, way that you officially make known your desires about how government should operate. And with that, I will take my seat. Thank you.
So I'd like to invite all the panelists up to the table. So at this point, if anyone in the audience has any questions, we will take those. But if you don't have any questions now, we've got some prepared questions that we can ask them. Yes?
I'll ask a question. What do any of you think about the idea of making voting day a holiday?
So the question is, and I'm going to repeat the questions just for the recording, what do the panelists think of the idea of making the voting day a federal holiday?
I personally think it would be a wonderful idea. I know, other countries have similar holidays. I'm sure there's many reasons why we don't. And unfortunately, I'm a cultural historian, so I'm a little out of my field of expertise on this, but I definitely think it's something that we should have and we should strive to, and it would make it so much easier for everybody to get out and exercise their vote. So I think look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say.
I support it 100%. As a matter of fact, and I know this would be a major change, but I also support not just the holiday, but also moving it to Saturday. That means easier time. People don't have to worry about work. But if you make it a holiday and then make it a Saturday, I believe you will have an easier time, easier access to voting.
And I will reiterate what my colleagues have said. I think that a voting holiday is something that we should consider, that we should agitate for, quite frankly, because it only increases access to the franchise of voting.
Yes, I see a question in the back.
Do you think that they don't put it as a holiday or put it on a Saturday in order to kind of have more control and like lessen like how y'all were talking about taking away opportunities for other people to be able to vote? Do you think they do that on purpose?
So the question is do they not put voting on weekends or or make it a holiday to try and put up barriers to keep control over the system?
Well, I'll say that I try not to presume the reasons that things are the way that they are, but rather to analyze the way that things are. And the reality is that the history of voting in the United States is one that the majority of people who enjoy the franchise today have had to agitate for in order to have access to. And it is because of that that I think it's so important for us to really recognize that voting is a hard-won reality for the majority of people in this room. And whether or not that is on purpose, I will leave that up to someone who's better equipped than I.
Well, as a political commentator, in addition to being a professor, I presume all the time. And I'm going to presume people. I just believe that there are a lot of people who are in political power. They make these decisions based on their opportunity to stay in political power. And a lot of people, and I'm going to use the state legislature as an example, because I think they point to what you were saying, a lot of it. A lot of people who dominate our state legislature believe that young people will not vote for people like them. They believe that young people are much more inclusive, certainly much more liberal in their thinking, and will not support some of the things that they do. So they put up those barriers. I make the point today in the commentary with what you just said. It is unconscionable to me that you can use a handgun carry permit to vote, but you can't use a valid student photo ID to vote. That's unconscionable to me. But that's one of those barriers that we're talking about. I just think that, again, looking at Ebony's really well thought out plan, go beyond those barriers, turn out to vote, especially in non-presidential election times. Show the politicians in Nashville that I'm going to vote despite the barriers that you put up, and I guarantee you they'll start paying attention. You agree with that?
See a question right here?
I have a question of what's the best way to convince some of my friends that voting is important? Because most of my friends are not political, I would say. So what's the best way to convince them that it's important?
So the question is, what's the best way to convince your non-political friends the importance of voting?
I love that question. In the classes that I teach, particularly in election years, this is a question that comes up all of the time. And I have thought about this and turned it upside down and looked inside and outside of it. And there are two things that I think can be useful. And of course, your friends and family better than I do. But the first is an acknowledgement that there's no such thing as being a non-political person. That everything is political. Everything is political. Because politics is about how we design the world in which we live. Who gets to participate in the world in which we live. And that could be everything from having, roads without potholes as you go to the grocery store, to having a safe neighborhood to live in, to having a school that has books that are not falling apart. All of those things are politics. I think that's the first thing, is kind of like this recognition, or at least helping people to see that even if you think that you're not political, you're political. And the other thing is, potentially to kind of help people compare voting to other areas in their life where they make decisions on a day-to-day basis, right? If you love fashion and you care about how you look, it's important for you to be involved in choosing your clothes, choosing what shoes that you wear, choosing the color of your lipstick or how you do your hair. If I were to take that over for you and make all of the decisions about what kind of clothes you wear, your sartorial choices, that robs you of your identity, that robs you of having a voice and a choice in how you present to the world. It's the same exact thing with voting, right? Just on a deeper level.
Couldn't say anything better than that.
Maybe the moderator, but as someone who's had a pothole in the last year, potholes are definitely political. I'd like to stop replacing my tires. See a question in the back?
Yeah, one of the questions addressed like making a voting holiday, and you also said maybe moving it to Saturday where more and more people can participate in an easier fashion. With the constant advance in technology, what do, and this is a question for everybody, what do you see as the next evolution of making it easier for someone to vote? To make it easier for somebody who maybe can't get to a polling place, stuff like that, to actually be able to participate in the process.
So the question is, with the continued updates in technology, what's maybe the next advent of making things easier to vote, or what's the next step technologically?
Well, I believe it could be doing more with online voting. Now, the problem with that is there are people every day trying to hack into systems, hack into your accounts, whether it's Instagram or Facebook. That's a trust problem there, because we already have right now a lack of trust in the voting process, and unfortunately, a lot of people have made that a political talking point by saying that voter integrity is at stake, and when it really wasn't, but people have made that a political issue. It would be great if, especially for young people, that they could vote as easily for the president or the mayor or the governor or the county mayor as they could vote for the American Idol winner. But that's not possible right now because of the lack of trust in a system like that. If we could get a foolproof system, and I don't know that exists, I'm not a technology person, but if we could get that, that would be the next great step here in making it very easy to vote, because you could vote on your phone. But I just don't see that happening anytime soon, because we have not perfected that technology to keep it from being compromised.
Audience question in the front, then we'll get to one in the back.
Go ahead.
Are you sure? All right, we'll start in the back then go to the front.
So I have friends who live in California, and they tell me that it's mail-in voting out there. Is it all mail-in voting? And if so, like, what are your thoughts on that? Because from what I've read, you're talking about tampering. It doesn't seem like it's an issue, and so it does make it more available to people. Maybe they don't have transportation, maybe they're in nursing homes, that kind of thing, or they have mobility issues for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, mail-in voting is the same as absentee voting. And yeah, I mean, people have been absentee voting for, forever. I have an older sister who can't get around anymore, but she never wants to miss a voting. So she is doing it by absentee now. Now, again, the problem here is that a lot of politicians have made these issues problematic when they really are not problematic. We have too many politicians, self-serving ones, who are trying, again, to stay in power by any means necessary, and they have convinced their base that there's a problem here, or that people are rigging the system, or that having a drop box close by is a problem. It's not a problem. People have been voting by mail, which again is absentee voting, forever. And it's perfectly legal, and I believe it's safe, and there should not be a problem. The problem is in the politicians who have made it a problem to their base.
And I'll reiterate, you know, in many ways, particularly in Tennessee, I'll focus on, there just is not political will to do that. We saw, particularly at the height of the pandemic, around the 2020 election, that because of the inherent danger, right, with people kind of, communing in that way, right, standing in lines to vote, that there was a recognition that it is not only safe to do, but also safer for the majority of people to be able to cast their ballot in that way. But unfortunately, there was a sunset provision on that. And so we see that we have returned to kind of the older rules around voting. And, you know, as Professor Sanford said, I think that there just really is not political will for that.
Oh, I was just maybe make a comment, looking at Professor Sanford's figures about those abysmally low turnouts for local Memphis city elections. A couple of years back, we had Douglas Brinkley, presidential historian, come to visit our campus and talk to our students, and he talked about a book that he wrote about Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And he made an excellent point, I thought. He said that Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans was as much of a man-made disaster as it was a natural disaster. And one of the man-made disasters was that the citizens of New Orleans elected people to mayor and local offices who were unqualified, who just didn't know what they were doing. They were, frankly, buffoons, according to him. And he claimed that that made the situation in New Orleans much worse. So if, Memphis were a utopia and we had no problems, it wouldn't matter who our mayor was or our city council members were. But we have issues, and then if we had a crisis, it would really, really matter who our mayor was, who our county commissioners were. And that people turn out to vote for the president, but really it's more important that we turn out to vote for the mayor and the city council and the county commission and county prosecutor. Those are the people that really affect our daily lives. And when there's a crisis, that is when that becomes imperative.
Right. And I would add to that, Dr. Rob, that we need to turn out for our county clerk office as well. Because it matters who holds that office. I'm not making any further comment on that, but you're talking about a crisis. I think we've had a crisis this year at the county clerk's office. But people don't know who the county clerk is until there is a crisis. And in this case, because it was strictly party line voting, our county clerk was able to win, even though her margin was a lot less than the other Democrats on the ballot. She was still able to win because she was a Democrat, and this was a Democrat wave. But we still have a crisis there that probably should have factored into the voting when it was.
Yeah, great example of why your local elections are so much.
Exactly.
And I'd like to add that this is one reason why I highlight education with respect to voting. That it is incumbent upon us to practice what Niccolo Machiavelli would call good habits as citizens. It is not enough for you to just show up at the polls. If you've never voted before, let me tell you that when you walk into that voting booth, there are going to be 1,000 names. There are going to be referenda that are written in language that feels like it was written 2 centuries ago. And it can be really kind of discombobulating to then realize while you're standing in that voting booth exactly what you are tasked with doing. So taking the time beforehand to learn who people are. Think about the fact that the people that we elect are not just leaders, but they are servant leaders. Their role and their purpose is to serve the people of the community. And so we need to, I think, necessarily be looking for people who understand that, who profess that openly, so that then as voters, we can also hold them accountable after we leave the voting booth as well. So all of those things, right, really begin to matter. And voting becomes much more than just, a one-day thing, but it is a continuous project and process.
And I'll add to that by saying that it is perfectly fine if you don't know people on the ballot to ask someone that you think does know. I'm the youngest in my family of siblings. I'm the youngest of 7 kids. And when I was young, they never paid any attention. Wouldn't let me do anything, didn't treat me as an equal, didn't think that I knew what I was doing. I was a baby. But now, as we all are old, and they know that I'm a journalist and that I do politics, they ask me, especially my oldest sister, calls me every election to find out who the candidates are, to tell me who, I don't tell her who to vote for, but I give her the pros and cons of the candidate. That's perfectly fine. And so, yeah, educate yourself by any means necessary, so that you can make some informed decisions when you go in there and again, make a plan. I like what you were saying about make a plan, because this is so important.
Could that also be a space we're looking for endorsements would matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, having worked for a newspaper for 35 years, Tom, you can relate to this. Newspapers historically have made political endorsements. I think most newspapers are sort of getting away from that now because they've gotten a lot of pushback. I still support it. Now, that's my old-fashioned journalism in me that says that if a newspaper is going to help a community with issues, if they're going to get involved in talking about whether we should put a third bridge there, or whether we should how we should fix the potholes that you were talking about, or how we should fix things in the county clerk's office, if the newspaper is going to help a community do that, I believe a newspaper should help a community at least make some informed decisions about candidates who are running for office, and then make recommendations based on that. Strictly on the editorial pages, not in the news sections of the paper. I think it's perfectly fine for newspapers to make endorsements, but they are getting away from that because they get so much pushback as a result of it.
A question over here, Darlene?
Yeah, and it's possible you may have just answered this, but I wanted to ask if you could go a little further on information-seeking habits for people who are interested in voting and might be intimidated by like 6 pages of judges. How can we, maximize our time, try to be as efficient if possible, and find out information about who we should vote for?
There are some really great organizations that kind of try to engage in that work. So one of them is Ballotpedia. If you go to ballotpedia.org before any election, you will be able to look by your state, your county, at the candidates and the ways in which they've answered certain questions, like, why do you want to run for dog catcher? What is it that you think the milkman does? And that can really be helpful, and it's in some ways it's like a one-stop shop. It's actually one of the tools that I use with students in some of my first-year classes when we begin talking about, well, how do I seek out information? I also think that, as Professor Sanford mentioned earlier, not to say that, you should vote the way your parents tell you to vote, but, if you trust your parents' decision-making, or you have an auntie or a grandparent, or even, someone here on campus, a professor, a librarian, whom you trust their decision-making, you can ask them also, how do you get information to make decisions about voting? there are so many different avenues that you can utilize in order to do that. I personally also look at people's Facebook pages. It's 2022, you know? And so all of that is a way to get information about who people are and what their true beliefs are.
When you talk about the judges, we did have a slew of judges in the August election. Thankfully, we only have that once every 8 years, so that's good. This is where I think the somewhat decline in the daily newspaper has hurt us. Because back in 20 years ago, the daily newspaper, and I'm talking about the commercial deal, had enough people that would vet those candidates and at least give you information about every candidate who's running for a judicial race. They can't afford to do that anymore because they don't have the staffing to do it. But there are other areas that you can go to. The next time this happens in 8 years, I'm sure the Memphis Bar Association will vet these candidates and put out recommendations. And then you also have the National Bar Association locally, which is called the Ben F. Jones chapter, which is primarily for African Americans, and they would do the same thing. So there's some avenues. Ballotpedia is a good one as well. There are some areas where you can go to find information, even on those numerous judges. But again, the good thing is you only have to do it once every 8 years.
Looks like we might have time for one more question. I would like to thank our panelists for coming and presenting to us today.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming and listening to this enlightening and interesting session. Thank you for increasing our understanding not only about voting in general, also about the youth vote in this country. All you young people, if you are older people too, if you haven't registered to vote yet, please stop by the table outside, register, make a plan, go vote. And I also want to thank everybody here at the libraries who has helped in organizing this event. Our Executive Director and Associate Dean, Dr. John Evans, sitting right there. Michelle, Anna, and all the folks who helped get the tables arranged, and Casey and Ben for doing the camera work and mic work and everything. So I really, really appreciate everybody's input in this event. Also want to thank the Shelby County Election Commission and for their representative who's come, and she's been with us all day. So thanks everybody, and thank you all again.